May 1945. The war in Europe is over. Church bells are ringing in London. Champagne is flowing in Paris. But in the mountains of Slovenia, a column of nearly 12,000 men is marching toward a forest called Kočevski Rog, and almost none of them will walk out alive. They are not Germans. They are not SS. They are former countrymen who chose the wrong side, and the men marching them into those woods have exactly zero interest in a trial. This is the story of how Yugoslavia settled its wartime accounts, not with courtrooms alone, but with mass graves, secret police, and a silence that lasted 40 years. This is the story of zero mercy. To understand the punishment, you first have to understand the crime. And in Yugoslavia, that crime was almost unimaginably complicated. When the Axis invaded in April 1941, the kingdom didn't just fall to a foreign enemy. It shattered into pieces, and Yugoslavs turned on each other with a viciousness that rivaled anything the Germans did. Croatia became the independent state of Croatia, a Nazi puppet regime run by the fascist Ustaše movement under Ante Pavelić. The Ustaše built concentration camps, Jasenovac chief among them, and carried out a campaign of extermination against Serbs, Jews, and Roma, so brutal that even some German officers were reportedly disturbed by it. In occupied Serbia, a puppet administration under General Milan Nedić governed on Berlin's behalf, backed by paramilitary forces loyal to the fascist ideologue Dimitra Ljotić. Meanwhile, Draža Mihailović's royalist Chetniks fought a murkier game, sometimes resisting the Axis, sometimes striking deals with Italian and German forces against their real enemy, Tito's communist partisans. In Slovenia, the Nazi-backed Home Guard policed the countryside for the occupiers, and scattered across the region, tens of thousands of ethnic Germans, the Volksdeutsche, enlisted directly into the Wehrmacht and SS. By 1945, Collaborator wasn't a small category. It described entire armies, entire administrations, entire ideological movements, hundreds of thousands of people who had worn a uniform, signed an order, or pulled a trigger for the Axis cause. And this is what made the Yugoslav case so different from, say, France or Norway. In Western Europe, collaboration mostly meant individuals, bureaucrats, informants, businessmen who profited from occupation. In Yugoslavia, it meant entire standing armies with their own uniforms, their own chains of command, and in the Ustaše's case, their own state. When the guns finally fell silent, Tito's new government wasn't just hunting down a few thousand traitors. It was staring down the wreckage of multiple rival governments and armed movements, all of whom had, at one point or another, fought alongside the occupiers against the partisans. While all of this was happening, one force was quietly building the most effective resistance movement in occupied Europe: Josip Broz Tito's communist-led partisans. Unlike the Chetniks, they refused to compromise with the occupiers. Unlike the puppet regimes, they fought under their own flag. And by the war's final year, they had grown from scattered guerrilla bands into a disciplined army of hundreds of thousands, backed increasingly by the Allies. When Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, the partisans weren't just liberators. They were the new government of Yugoslavia, and they arrived with a list of scores to settle that stretched back 4 brutal years. Here is where the story turns dark, and where historians still argue bitterly over numbers and blame. As the war ended, roughly 200,000 people, Ustaše soldiers, Chetniks, Slovene Home Guard troops, and terrified civilians who feared communist retribution, fled north toward Austria, hoping to surrender to the British rather than to Tito's partisans. They believed the Western Allies would treat them as prisoners of war and eventually let them go. They were wrong. Near the Austrian town of Bleiburg, British forces turned the columns back, handing responsibility for these men and women over to the Yugoslav partisans. What followed became known as the Way of the Cross, forced marches back into Yugoslavia, during which thousands were shot along the roadside, worked to death, or executed on arrival. Others were funneled into hastily organized camps. The single most infamous episode came at Kočevski Rog, deep in the Slovenian forest, where partisan units executed thousands of Home Guard soldiers and other prisoners without any trial at all. herded to pits and ravines, and shot in the days after they had already surrendered. There was no due process here, no tribunal, no defense counsel, no appeal. Survivors later described being stripped of valuables, tied together in long columns, and marched for days without food before reaching the killing sites. Some were shot in batches at the edge of natural sinkholes known locally as foibe, their bodies left where they fell. Others were transported by rail toward camps and simply never arrived. Historians estimate that in these first chaotic weeks after victory, partisan forces summarily killed somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 people, a range so wide precisely because so much of it happened off the books, buried in unmarked pits that wouldn't even be acknowledged by the state for decades. To this day, forensic teams in Slovenia and Croatia continue to locate and excavate mass graves from this period, adding new names to a body count that historians privately admit may never be fully settled. Behind much of this violence stood OSNA, the Department for the Protection of the People, Tito's new secret police, formed in 1944 explicitly to hunt down collaborators, informants, and enemies of the people. OSNA didn't just interrogate suspects, it compiled lists, ran military courts, and in many cases, simply decided who deserved to live. For the regime, this wasn't chaos, it was policy, even if much of it happened outside any formal legal framework. The new communist government wanted two things simultaneously: revenge for 4 years of occupation and civil war, and a clean slate on which to build a one-party socialist state. Eliminating collaborators served both goals at once. It punished wartime enemies while conveniently erasing potential future opposition, royalists, nationalists, and rival political movements that might have challenged Tito's monopoly on power. OSNA agents fanned out across every republic with local informants feeding them names, and in the confusion of a country still full of displaced people and disarmed soldiers, it was often impossible to distinguish a genuine war criminal from a low-ranking conscript, a village policeman, or someone simply denounced by a jealous neighbor. Being on the wrong list, at the wrong checkpoint, on the wrong day in the spring of 1945 could be a death sentence with no appeal process whatsoever. Not everything was extrajudicial slaughter in the forest. Yugoslavia also staged very public, very deliberate trials of its most notorious collaborators, trials designed as much for propaganda as for justice. The most dramatic was the 1946 trial of General Draža Mihailović, the Chetnik commander who had once been celebrated in the West as a resistance hero and even received American military decorations. The communist court methodically dismantled that image, presenting evidence of his force's collaboration with Axis occupiers against the partisans. Mihailović was convicted of treason and war crimes and executed by firing squad, a verdict so politically charged that Serbian courts would controversially overturn it nearly 70 years later, in 2015. General Milan Nedić, the wartime head of the puppet Serbian administration, died in custody before facing trial, officially ruled a suicide, though the circumstances remain disputed to this day. Ante Pavelić, the Ustaše leader responsible for some of the war's worst atrocities, escaped Yugoslavia entirely, fleeing through Vatican-linked rat lines to Argentina, and was tried and sentenced only in absentia. He was never brought to justice, dying of wounds from an assassination attempt years later in Spain. Lower down the chain of command, thousands of lower-level officials, camp guards, propagandists, and local officials who had served the occupation regimes did face actual courts. Sentences ranged from short prison terms to hard labor to execution, administered through a mix of military tribunals and newly formed people's courts that operated with communist judges and very little tolerance for acquittal. These proceedings moved fast, sometimes disposing of dozens of cases in a single day, and defense attorneys, when they were present at all, had little real power to challenge the state's version of events. Guilty verdicts were the overwhelming norm, and appeals were rare. For the new government, speed and visibility mattered as much as legal precision. Broadcasting swift justice against known collaborators helped cement the partisans' claim to moral authority over the country they now ruled. One group faced a particularly harsh and often overlooked reckoning: Yugoslavia's ethnic German minority, the Volksdeutsche. Even those who had never worn a uniform were collectively stripped of citizenship, property, and legal protection after the war, on the theory that the entire community had supported the occupation. Tens of thousands were interned in camps under conditions that killed thousands more through starvation, disease, and exposure, while survivors were eventually expelled from the country altogether. It was collective punishment on an ethnic scale, a policy that today sits uneasily alongside the language of post-war justice. For nearly 4 decades, none of this, the mass executions, Bleiburg, Kočevski Rog, could be spoken about openly inside Yugoslavia. Tito's government built its entire legitimacy on the myth of a unified, heroic, partisan liberation. Acknowledging that liberation had come soaked in extrajudicial bloodshed threatened that foundation directly. It wasn't until the 1980s, as communist authority weakened, that survivors, historians, and Slovenian and Croatian voices began speaking publicly about the killing fields. And when Yugoslavia itself violently disintegrated in the 1990s, the post-war reckoning became a political weapon all over again. Nationalist movements in Croatia and Serbia invoked Bleiburg and the purges to reframe wartime collaborators as martyrs, while others insisted the executions were a justified response to genuine atrocities. So was it justice, or was it vengeance dressed up as justice? The honest answer is both, tangled together in ways that are almost impossible to fully separate. Real war criminals were punished. So were people whose only crime was standing on the losing side of a civil war within a war. Formal courts operated alongside forests, full of unmarked graves, sometimes in the very same week. What's undeniable is the scale. Somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 people were killed in Yugoslavia's post-war reckoning, a number that rivals the formal legal purges of France, Italy, and Czechoslovakia combined, carried out by a country determined to make absolutely sure its Axis collaborators never got a second chance. And unlike Nuremberg, where the world watched judges weigh evidence in a public courtroom, most of this reckoning happened in silence, in forests, and in files that stayed locked away for 2 generations. That gap between the trial the world remembers and the killings the world forgot is exactly why Yugoslavia's post-war purge remains one of the most argued-over chapters of the entire Second World War. If you want to understand how the 20th century's bloodiest continent tried, and often failed, to draw a clean line between justice and revenge, Yugoslavia's zero-mercy reckoning is as clear a lesson as history has to offer. If you found this story as unsettling as we did, subscribe for more deep dives into the parts of World War II history that rarely make it into the textbooks.